Hello. Okay, so today we're going to talk about how to write a successful lab report. Now all of this is also in a Word document, which is in Edmodo, and you also got it the first day of class. But in case you need a quick refresher, we're just going to go over each part of a lab report relatively quickly. So first, the purpose of doing a lab report is basically to demonstrate what you've learned. Now, not everyone loves writing lab reports, but it is a good way to practice how to communicate your findings and to make connections between concepts, two really important things in science, no matter what class you're in. We're going to submit these lab reports on Edmodo. Because they're electronic, feel free to take pictures with your cell phone, insert those in place, maybe a description of a piece of equipment. You could take a video. Anything that you want to do is pretty wide open because it's electronic. You're going to work with other people on these labs. I don't want you to do any by yourself, but please keep in mind the difference between collaboration and cheating. You can discuss things together, but when it comes to writing the lab report, you need to do that on your own. That must be your own words and your own work. Okay, so the parts of a lab report, we've got the title, abstract, purpose, hypothesis, materials and procedure and safety, data and observations, analysis and calculations, and then the conclusion. Okay, before you can conduct the lab, and you would need to check this with me, you must complete all the pre-lab work. This will be done, again, individually, but you can discuss it with your lab partners. This will involve the title, leaving space for the abstract. You're not going to write it yet. The purpose and hypothesis, the materials, procedure, and safety, and setting up for the data and observations. So first, let's talk about the title. You need to make sure that your title is centered. It's descriptive of the lab. You can use the one I give you or come up with your own. And also make sure to include the date the lab was conducted and your lab partners. So let me show you an example of how I've set up a title for a lab report. Okay, so here, as you can see, is an example of the title page for lab reports. I've got my title in a larger font, and it's centered a little less than halfway down the page. And then below that, I've got the date the lab was conducted, as well as my name first, because it's my lab, but then the people that I worked with on the lab as well. Okay, so the next part is the purpose and hypothesis. So for the purpose, and the rest of these components would all contain a heading, so you'd have the purpose heading, the hypothesis heading. For the purpose, why are you conducting the lab? And this can either be written as a statement or a question. So for example, the purpose of this lab is to, and then continue on, or write it as a question. What is the difference between sunlight and dark on the growth of a plant? Okay, so you could put it as a question or a sentence. The hypothesis, what do you think is going to happen when you conduct this lab? And it needs to be written as an if, then, because statement. So you're going to put if and then your independent variable. So for example, in the plant example, we are changing the different types of light, so independent variable, what we're changing, and then the dependent variable would be plant growth, because that's what's changing as a result of our independent variable. So we would probably theorize that sunlight would cause the plant to grow more than no light, because plants require sunlight to conduct photosynthesis. So our because portion is due to our research, or getting our background information from our chemistry knowledge. The next part of the pre-lab material, or pre-lab work, are materials, procedure, and safety. So for the materials, what are you using in the lab? Usually we split it into two categories: equipment, which would be glassware, glass stirring rods, thermometer, and what are called reagents, or the chemicals that we're going to use. We usually put materials in a bulleted list, so you could either do one long list or you could do some columns. The next part is the procedure. What are you going to be doing in the lab? And write this so that someone else reading your lab could conduct the lab. We usually put the procedure in steps, and so make them somewhat concise, but at the same time, they need to be understandable for somebody else. The only time you would not be doing materials in a column or list and procedure and steps is if this was more of a cookbook style lab where the procedure was already set out for you. In this case, there's no need to rewrite the materials and procedures since they're not changing, and so you could just summarize the materials and the procedure into one paragraph, which is also a good skill to be able to summarize, so pick out the important pieces and summarize it. Then you also need to include safety. So what dangers exist and what personal protective equipment should you be wearing for this lab? Next part of the pre-lab work are data and observations. Now you're not going to actually make any observations, you're just going to decide on the best way to represent the information that you're going to collect. This usually involves creating a table of some kind. When you create your table, make sure you leave enough columns for headings to include labels and units if appropriate. And remember, observations are just as important as numerical data. Some labs that we're going to do don't involve any measurement of data, it's more observations. And so this would be the difference in qualitative versus quantitative data. So to create a table, and you could do this in Word, you would go up to Insert, Table, and then you can choose whatever columns or rows you want, and you can see that as I select this, it's creating the table for me. If this isn't enough of an option, you can also go to Insert Table below the chart and create your own number of columns and rows. And once you hit OK, it would insert your table. So that seems to be the easiest way to create a table. Okay, so once all of this pre-lab work has been done and completed, we are going to discuss it and make sure that you understand what's going on in the lab and that everything has been completed. Make sure everyone in your group has this done, or else no one can conduct the lab. It's also very important to be safe and make sure you collect your data appropriately. After the lab, you're going to move into post-lab work. Now this would involve analysis and calculations, conclusion, and writing the abstract. So let's talk about analysis and calculations first. Calculations are not always required. Again, this depends on the type of data that you're collecting. But in order to, if you do have calculations, you do need to show all your work. The easiest way to do this is to use the equation editor. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so in this document, I've already typed in an equation. I'm converting from grams of copper to moles of copper. And I've estimated the calculation. Obviously, you would do it on a calculator. So let's do another example so I can show you how you maybe would put numbers in to do dimensional analysis, which is going to probably be the most common form of a calculation for chemistry. So once you've got your lab report and you're ready to add in a calculation, you're going to insert. All the way over, you're going to go to equation. And it gives you this blue box that says type equation here. And then up on the equation tools, you've got all kinds of things that you can do. So let's say I want to go, instead of going from grams to moles, I'm going to go from liters to milliliters. That one seems a little bit more common since we're just starting out. So let's do 3.5 liters, and I want to convert it to milliliters. So I'm going to set up a dimensional analysis. I know that for every 1 liter, there's 1,000 milliliters. So I'm going to times, and now I need my conversion factor, or my fraction, like I did with most grams. So I've got lots of options here. What I'm looking for is the fraction. And even within fractions, I can set it up quite differently. But I think this one seems the most clear. So I'm going to go with that first one. All right, I know I want liters on the bottom, so I'm going to click the bottom box, 1 liter. And then in my top box, I know that there are 1,000 milliliters for every 1 liter. And I'm going to arrow over until my cursor is centered on the fraction. Because now I'm not in either the numerator or the denominator. I'm at the end of the fraction. And I'm going to do my equal sign. And then at this point I would calculate, well, 3.5 times 1,000. I'm just going to add 3 zeros or move my decimal 3 spots. So that's going to give me 3500. And then I also need to make sure to include my units. Once I'm done, I hit enter. And now it's there. I can move it wherever I would like. I can save it as a new equation. I don't know if that would be very helpful. I could change the justification. I can put it over to the left. I can also grab it and move it if I want. Okay, so lots of options with the equation editor, and if you need any other help, please let me know. Okay, so the next part is the analysis. Now, this may or may not be present in a lab just like the calculations. So for the analysis, it's usually a set of questions to answer. You do not need to rewrite the question, but if the lab is given in a Word document and you want to copy the questions over, that's fine, but you don't have to. You do need to include the question number and make sure that you use complete sentences. So this way you're actually answering the question in complete sentences, the question is needed. Make sure that you justify a lot of your answers with data and results from the lab, which also carries over into the conclusion. So the conclusion consists of 3 paragraphs, and basically you're trying to talk about what do the results mean. And this is probably the most difficult part of the lab because you have to take all that information and condense it down and figure out, what did I do? What does it mean? So the first paragraph, you're going to restate the purpose, summarize the procedure very quickly, 1 to 2 sentences. Don't give super specifics, just say what you did. Then you're going to also state, and this is the most important part, was the hypothesis supported or not? You can't really prove a hypothesis, but you can collect data that supports what you said you thought was going to happen or didn't. So that would be kind of a yes or a no. And then you also need to say, well, How do you know that? You need to cite data from the lab and support your answer with data. If you get anything from how to write a lab report, that is key. Support anything that you're saying or any conclusions that you're making with data and results from the lab. The second paragraph, you're going to discuss error and how it affects your results. Don't include human error like we measured wrong, because we're going to assume that you followed the procedure correctly, and if that did happen, you've redone it to account for that. You can include things that are inherent to the lab. For example, we're going to do a calorimetry lab where our insulator is a piece of paper. Obviously, a piece of paper is not the best insulator, so you would say, that we used a piece of paper as an insulator. That would be the error. And then to discuss how it affects the results, well, obviously some heat escaped, so our heat collected is actually less than what actually occurred. So that's a discussion of the results along with the error. Make sure you include both parts. This can be tricky, so if you need help, please ask ahead of time. The third paragraph is a discussion of the chemistry concept. You're going to relate what you have learned about chemistry to this lab. So if we're discussing, a lab on balancing equations, then you might also talk about what the parts of a chemical equation are. Where's the reactant located? Where are the products located? Things like that. So take the chemistry knowledge and pull it into the lab. So give a brief summary of what you know about the topic being covered. Also discuss ways to either improve the lab or some next steps or other labs that you would do based on this lab. Okay, so the last part that we're going to discuss is the abstract. This is written last, but it is placed first after the title in the lab. And it's basically a summary of the lab. So if someone is researching a particular topic, they can just read the abstract of your lab and find out what your results were instead of reading your entire lab report that tells them, oh, okay, this lab relates to what I'm studying, so I want to read it in more depth, or no, this isn't what I'm looking for, and go on to the next one. It's about one total paragraph in length. You're again going to restate the purpose, summarize the procedure very quickly, and then discuss, was your hypothesis supported and how do you know? So briefly discuss your important results. Remember, not all of your results, just the important ones. Just briefly mention any major errors that influenced your results and maybe a final thought. But again, we're trying to keep this into a paragraph, and it's an overall summary of your lab. The last thing you're going to do before submitting your lab is fill out the lab report rubric. So you're going to attach a copy of this with each submitted lab report. You can either make it the last page or you could attach it separately. And you're going to evaluate your own work. So when you look at the rubric, you're going to highlight where you think you fall for each category. And this is to help guide your work on the lab report. So let's take a look at an example of that. Okay, so here is the lab report grading rubric for CP Chemistry, but for any other lab writing class, it's very similar. You can see we've got organization and neatness, the PreLab work, the experimental design, testing, and lab performance, and then basically the PostLab work, including conclusions. And so you're going to basically just highlight where you think you fall on this. And so let's say for organization, you think you did pretty well, but it could be a little better. So just highlight that. And you could do it in any color, or you could underline it, or however you want to highlight it. This just seems to be more visual. And then make sure that this also gets attached when you submit your lab report. Hey, please make sure you ask me with any questions. And again, don't put off writing the lab report. Once you get into it, you'll find it's not that hard. And practice will help. So the more lab reports you write, the better you'll get and the more comfortable you'll feel. Have a good day. Okay, so just a quick reminder for your check for understanding for this lab. You're going to watch the pre-lab video for the slime lab, do all the pre-lab work, get it checked, conduct the slime lab, and then write your first lab report. Have fun!